The cracked ceramic of the coffee mug felt hot against my fingers, a small island of warmth in the endless, chilly night of the diner. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the neon sign into a smear of red and blue. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when ghosts and regrets come out to play, and my mind was a playground for both. Each scraped plate, each refilled cup was a tick on a clock counting down to nothing. I moved through the motions like an automaton, my body aching with a weariness that went bone deep, a fatigue born not just from a 16-hour shift, but from years of running from him, running from the memory of screeching tires and shattering glass. The weight of my sister's absence and the crushing debt her accident left behind was a physical presence, a stone in my chest. Taking out the last bag of trash was my final task. The back alley was a slick, dark throat reeking of stale grease and decay. A weak groan cut through the drumming of the rain, a sound of pure agony that stopped my heart. In the shadows, slumped against the overflowing dumpster, was a man, and he was bleeding a lot. My first instinct, the one that had kept me alive for the last 2 years, was to run, to turn around, walk back inside, lock the door, and pretend I saw nothing. The city had taught me that. The cracked ceramic of the coffee mug felt hot against my fingers, a small island of warmth in the endless, chilly night of the diner. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the neon sign into a smear of red and blue. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when ghosts and regrets come out to play, and my mind was a playground for both. Each scraped plate, each refilled cup was a tick on a clock counting down to nothing. I moved through the motions like an automaton, my body aching with a weariness that went bone deep, a fatigue born not just from a 16-hour shift, but from years of running from him, running from the memory of screeching tires and shattering glass. The weight of my sister's absence and the crushing debt her accident left behind was a physical presence, a stone in my chest. Taking out the last bag of trash was my final task. The back alley was a slick, dark throat reeking of stale grease and decay. A weak groan cut through the drumming of the rain, a sound of pure agony that stopped my heart. In the shadows, slumped against the overflowing dumpster, was a man, and he was bleeding a lot. My first instinct, the one that had kept me alive for the last 2 years, was to run, to turn around, walk back inside, lock the door, and pretend I saw nothing. The city had taught me that kindness was a liability, a weakness predators exploited. Every nerve screamed at me to disappear, to remain the ghost I had tried so hard to become. But then he shifted, and a sliver of moonlight caught the raw pain on his face. And I saw a human being, not a threat. I saw someone's son, someone's brother. I saw a life slipping away into the grimy water pooling on the asphalt. No one deserves to die alone in an alley. The thought was a rebellion against the fear. If you've ever felt that pull to help, even when you're scared, maybe you'll understand. And if this story is already speaking to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Before I could second guess it, I was kneeling beside him, pulling off the worn cashmere scarf my sister had given me for my last birthday. My hands were shaking as I pressed the soft fabric against the gushing wound in his side, the material instantly turning a dark, sickening crimson. He woke to silence and the scent of antiseptic. The ceiling was a vast expanse of white, unfamiliar and cold. This wasn't a hospital. Hospitals had the constant beep of machinery, the distant murmur of voices. This was a tomb of glass and steel, a penthouse overlooking a city that glittered like a carpet of shattered diamonds. His right-hand man, Leo, stood by the window, his reflection a stoic shadow against the skyline. "You were lucky," Leo said, his voice flat. "They missed everything vital. The woman who found you made an anonymous call." The man on the bed, Dante Volkov, pushed himself up, ignoring the sharp protest from his ribs. His memory was a fractured mosaic. The sting of betrayal, the roar of an engine, the searing pain, and then a woman's face, pale with fear, but her eyes filled with a fierce compassion. He remembered gentle hands pressing down, a soft voice murmuring reassurances. On the bedside table, cleaned and perfectly folded, was a cashmere scarf. He picked it up. In his world, there were no accidents, no coincidences, only transactions. And a life for a life was the most sacred debt of all. "Find her," Dante commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Find the girl who owns this." The knock on my apartment door was so sharp and authoritative, it felt like a hammer blow against my skull. I had barely been home an hour, the adrenaline from the alley finally giving way to a paralyzing dread. I expected the police, arriving to ask questions I couldn't answer. But when I peered through the peephole, my blood ran cold. It was him, the man from the alley. He was no longer a broken figure bleeding out in the rain. He stood tall and imposing, dressed in a black suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to absorb the dim light of the hallway. The man beside him was built like a bulldog, his eyes scanning every shadow with unnerving intensity. I opened the door a crack, my hand trembling on the knob. The man's gaze was heavy, pinning me in place. He didn't smile. He simply held out my scarf, now impossibly clean. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice a low gravel that vibrated through the floor. I took it, my fingers brushing his. A strange jolt like static electricity shot up my arm. "You saved my life," he continued, his eyes locking onto mine. "That creates a debt. Your safety is now my responsibility." Before I could form a single word to respond to his insane declaration, a familiar, dreaded voice sliced through the tension. "Elena, baby, not making friends with the neighbors, are you?" Mark Jensen, my ex. He rounded the corner of the hallway, his police uniform immaculate, his smile a predatory slash that never reached his cold, empty eyes. He sauntered toward us, radiating a proprietary arrogance that made my skin crawl. "You weren't answering my calls," he said, his tone a syrupy threat. He tried to shoulder his way past me into the apartment, his gaze sweeping over my small living space with a look of entitled disgust. My body went rigid, the old familiar terror wrapping around my throat like a vice. He was a master of subtle intimidation, of using his badge and his size to make me feel small and powerless. "We need to talk about that little loose end, Ellie," he murmured, his eyes flicking down to my hands as if he expected me to be holding the SD card he was so obsessed with. He was a monster wearing a hero's uniform, and he was standing in my doorway, bringing the past I had nearly died to escape right back to me. The man in the suit, Dante, hadn't moved, hadn't spoken a word, but the entire dynamic in the cramped hallway shifted. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a silent, lethal energy. Mark's swagger faltered as he finally took in the man standing beside me. I saw the flicker of confusion in Mark's eyes, the cop in him trying to assess a threat he couldn't categorize. Dante wasn't big like a bouncer or twitchy like a street thug. He was perfectly, unnervingly still. He simply watched Mark, his expression unreadable, his gaze holding the flat, chilling emptiness of a frozen lake. It was the look of a predator that had never known fear, an apex hunter who had just found a lesser beast trespassing in his territory. Mark, who thrived on intimidating others, was suddenly the one being sized up and found wanting. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his dominance. "This is a private matter," he snapped, gesturing vaguely with his thumb. "Police business." Dante didn't even blink. He just took a single, deliberate step forward, positioning his body slightly in front of mine. It was a shield, a claim, a warning delivered without a sound. The unspoken message was as clear as a gunshot in a library. Mark's bravado crumbled. He looked from Dante's cold, unyielding face to Leo's watchful stance, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He was a bully who had just run into a wall of granite. He opened his mouth, then closed it, the threats and manipulative words dying on his tongue. With a forced, ugly sneer, he took a step back. "Fine, we'll talk later, Elena," he spat, the promise in his voice making my stomach clench. He turned and walked away, his retreat far too quick to be casual. The hallway was suddenly silent again, but the peace was gone. The illusion of my anonymous, hidden life had been shattered. I was left standing in my doorway, shaking, caught between the monster I knew and the terrifying enigma who had just made him run. I looked up at Dante, at his dark, unreadable eyes, and realized my act of kindness hadn't just saved a life, it had chained me to a world I couldn't comprehend. "He will not bother you again," Dante stated, his voice a low vow that sounded less like a promise and more like a sentence. My world had just cracked wide open, and I had no idea if this man was my savior or my damnation. The silence Dante left behind was louder than any argument. For a day, I breathed it in, telling myself it was freedom. But freedom doesn't pay the rent. The next morning, my manager, a balding man named Stan, who usually had a kind word for everyone, called me into his greasy little office. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just kept rearranging a stack of napkins on his desk, his hands trembling slightly. "Elena, I have to let you go," he mumbled, his voice strained. I asked why, though I already knew the answer. I had seen Mark's patrol car parked across the street earlier that morning, a silent, predatory sentinel. Stan just shook his head. "We're downsizing. It's not personal." But it was. It was deeply, terrifyingly personal. I walked out of the diner, the place that had been my grueling sanctuary for 2 years, and felt the city's cold indifference swallow me whole. I was adrift again, but this time I had a distinct feeling that a shark was circling, and Mark had just chummed the water with my livelihood. He wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. He was systematically dismantling my life, piece, painful piece, ensuring I had nowhere left to run. The eviction notice was the next blow, taped to my door like a declaration of war. The crisp white paper, with its bold, unforgiving letters, felt like a physical slap. My landlord, who had always been understanding about me being a few days late, was suddenly demanding 2 months' rent in advance, or I'd be out by the end of the week. I knew Mark's fingerprints were all over this, his insidious influence spreading like a poison through my already fragile existence. I spent the next 48 hours in a frantic haze, pounding the pavement, walking into every restaurant, cafe, and bar I could find, begging for a job. Each time it was the same story, a polite but firm rejection, a vague excuse, an apologetic smile that didn't reach their eyes. It was as if a citywide memo had gone out with my face on it, branding me as unemployable. My friend Sophia slipped me $100, her face etched with worry. "Be careful, Elle," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the street. "He's not right in the head." I knew she was right. I was trapped in a tightening net, and the man pulling the strings was wearing a badge, making him untouchable. The psychological warfare began in earnest. It started subtly. A window I was sure I had locked would be slightly ajar when I got home. My sister's favorite book, which I kept on my nightstand, would be on the kitchen counter instead. They were small, insignificant things, designed to make me feel like I was losing my mind, to erode my sense of safety in the one place I had left. Then came the phone calls. No one would speak. There was just static on the other end, a hollow, empty sound that was somehow more menacing than any threat. I'd hang up, my heart hammering against my ribs, only for it to ring again moments later. I stopped answering, but the shrill sound echoed in the tiny apartment, a constant reminder of my vulnerability. I was living on a knife's edge, sleeping in 2-hour increments, jumping at every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distance. Mark was turning my home into a prison, and he was the warden, watching me through invisible cameras, enjoying my slow descent into paranoia and terror. He wasn't just trying to find an SD card anymore. He was trying to break me, to shatter my spirit until I had nothing left. I was walking home after another soul-crushing day of rejection, the damp city air clinging to me like a shroud, when a long black sedan slid to a silent stop beside me. The windows were so dark, they reflected my own exhausted, defeated face back at me. The passenger door opened, and Leo, Dante's bulldog of a right-hand man, got out. He didn't say a word, just held the door open, his expression a flat, unreadable mask. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to disappear into the crowd. But where would I go? Back to the empty apartment where the walls seemed to be breathing? Back to a life that was methodically being erased? A strange fatalistic calm settled over me. I was tired of running. I was tired of being afraid. Without a word, I slid into the buttery leather seat. The door closed with a heavy final thud, sealing me inside. The interior smelled of rich leather and something else, something clean and masculine that was unmistakably Dante. He was sitting in the opposite corner, a still, powerful silhouette against the city lights, and I felt his gaze on me, heavy and analytical, taking in every frayed edge of my existence. The restaurant was a world of hushed elegance and shimmering crystal, a place so far removed from my reality it felt like another planet. Dante led me to a secluded booth in the back, the kind reserved for people who owned the world, not the ones who served it. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, parting the sea of wealthy patrons without a single word. Once we were seated, he didn't bother with pleasantries. He simply slid a thin file across the polished mahogany table. "You were fired 2 days ago. Your landlord was paid a visit by a Detective Jensen, who suggested your apartment might be a hub for illegal activity. You have an eviction hearing on Friday, which you will lose." His voice was a low, emotionless monotone, each word a perfectly placed stone, building a wall of facts around me. He knew everything. The sheer scope of his knowledge was terrifying. He paused, his dark eyes finally locking onto mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something beneath the icy control. It was a cold, disciplined rage, a dangerous stillness that promised utter devastation. "He is attempting to isolate you," Dante stated, as if discussing a tactical maneuver. "He is hunting you." He let the weight of that reality settle before he continued, his voice dropping even lower, drawing me into a vortex of impossible choices. "This ends now," he declared, not as a promise, but as a statement of irrefutable fact. "You will not go back to that apartment. I have a residence for you, a penthouse in a secure building my organization owns. It is impenetrable." My breath hitched, the words catching in my throat. He wasn't finished. "You are in debt. That debt is now cleared. Consider it a signing bonus." He pushed a bank statement across the table. My sister's medical bills, the funeral costs, the crushing number that had been my constant nightmare for 2 years, was gone, paid in full. "You will work for me," he went on, his gaze unwavering. "My logistics company requires an administrative manager. The position is yours. You will be compensated well, and you will be under my direct supervision at all times." It was a rescue. It was a prison. He was offering me a golden cage, a life of safety and security, at the cost of the one thing I had left, my freedom. "No, The word came out as a strangled whisper, but it was filled with all the defiance I could muster. I pushed the file and the bank statement back toward him. I don't want your money. I don't want your job. And I certainly don't want your golden cage. My voice grew stronger, fueled by a surge of desperate pride. I saved your life because you were a person bleeding in an alley, not because I wanted to be bought. I've spent the last 2 years running from a man who wanted to control every aspect of my life, a man who thought he owned me. I will not trade one monster for another, no matter how well dressed he is. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor, drawing a few curious glances. Thank you for the dinner, but I can take care of myself. It was a lie, a pathetic, transparent lie, and we both knew it. I was drowning, and he was offering me a life raft, but it looked too much like the ship that had tried to sink me in the first place. Fear of the known was still more powerful than the terror of the unknown, and Mark was a devil I already knew intimately. Dante didn't move. He simply watched me with those cold, calculating eyes, letting my defiant speech hang in the air until it withered and died. "Sit down, Alina," he commanded, his voice soft but laced with steel. Reluctantly, I sank back into the booth. He gestured to Leo, who placed a single slim laptop on the table and turned it to face me. The screen lit up with a video file. It was security footage from a street corner, grainy and time-stamped 2 years ago. I saw a car, my car, speeding through an intersection. Then I saw another car, a dark sedan, deliberately swerving, ramming into my passenger side with brutal force. My sister, Sophia, was in that seat. The footage continued, showing the driver of the sedan getting out. It was Mark. He walked over to my wrecked car, peered inside, and then, seeing the extent of the damage, he got back in his vehicle and drove away. It wasn't an accident. It was attempted murder. "He wasn't trying to stop you from leaving him," Dante said, his voice a deadly quiet whisper. "He was trying to kill you. He believes you have an SD card with evidence of his dealings with a rival family. He will not stop until he has it or until you are dead." The world tilted on its axis. The air rushed from my lungs, leaving a hollow, aching void. Sophia, my sister. Her death wasn't my fault. It wasn't a tragic consequence of my desperate flight. It was a cold-blooded, deliberate act. The guilt that had been my constant companion for 2 years, the heavy cloak of self-blame I wore every single day, was a lie. It was all a lie. All that remained was a grief so pure and a rage so profound it left me breathless. I looked from the horrific images on the screen to Dante's unreadable face. He wasn't offering me a cage. He was offering me a fortress. He was offering me a weapon. He saw the shift in my eyes, the dawning, terrible understanding. The choice was no longer between freedom and captivity. It was between life and death, between justice and letting a monster win. My entire body trembled as the weight of my new reality settled upon me. I had been fighting the wrong war, haunted by the wrong ghosts. Now I finally saw the real enemy. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the first one that felt truly clear in years. "Okay," I whispered, the single word sealing my fate. "I'll do it." The penthouse was less a home and more a museum of a life I couldn't imagine living. It was a vast expanse of glass, chrome, and cold white marble that stretched across the entire top floor of a skyscraper, offering a god's eye view of the city that had tried to swallow me whole. My old apartment could have fit into the master closet. There were no worn-out books, no chipped mugs, no framed photos of my sister. Just an unnerving, sterile perfection. Dante laid out the terms of my new existence with the detached precision of a surgeon. I was not to leave the building without Leo. My phone was gone, replaced by a sleek, encrypted device that only had 3 numbers programmed into it: his, Leo's, and an emergency line. My days were to follow a strict schedule, from meals to my new work. It was absolute safety. It was also a cage, gilded and beautiful, but a cage nonetheless. I had spent 2 years fighting for the freedom to be anonymous, to be no one, and in a single night, I had become the most valuable, most guarded possession of a man who ruled a hidden kingdom. The silence was the worst part. It was so profound it felt like I was underwater, screaming without a sound. My new job was as artificial as the rest of my life. I was driven to a gleaming office tower with the name Volkov Global Logistics etched in discreet silver letters on the glass doors. It was a legitimate, thriving enterprise, a perfect mask for the empire it funded. I was given a corner office with a panoramic view and a computer that hums with quiet efficiency. My title was Senior Logistics Coordinator, a fancy name for a job that consisted of reviewing shipping manifests and cross-referencing invoices, tasks so simple a child could do them. It was busy work, designed to keep me occupied and contained within the fortress. The other employees treated me with a strange mixture of deference and fear. They would nod politely, their eyes skittering away from mine, never engaging in conversation. They knew I was his. Leo was my ever-present shadow, a silent, imposing figure who sat at a desk just outside my office door. He was my guard, my chauffeur, my keeper. I tried to push back, asking questions about the cargo in the manifests, trying to understand the business, but Leo would just smile his thin, humorless smile and say, "That's above your pay grade, Alina." I was a well-cared-for pet, given a toy to keep me from chewing the furniture. Dante insisted we have dinner together every night. We sat at opposite ends of a long, polished diamond table that could have seated 20, the city lights twinkling below us like a fallen constellation. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it expertly. I finally broke it one evening, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the cavernous room. "Why are you doing this? The debt is paid. My bills are gone. You saved me from Mark. We're even." He paused, his fork hovering over a piece of perfectly cooked steak. "A life is not a bill to be paid," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is a responsibility to be carried. You are a loose end in my world now. Your safety is tied to mine. Leaving you to fend for yourself would be a strategic error." His cold, brutal logic infuriated me. I wasn't a person to him. I was a tactical problem. I pushed my plate away, my appetite gone. "I'm not a strategic error," I snapped. He looked at me then, his gaze intense. "No," he conceded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "You are not." He slid my plate back in front of me. "Eat," he commanded, his tone softening almost imperceptibly. "You cannot fight a war on an empty stomach." The first sign that his fortress had cracks appeared 4 days into my gilded imprisonment. Leo entered Dante's study, his usually placid face tight with concern. He held a tablet, the screen showing a live feed from a security camera on the street below. He pointed to a drab, unremarkable plumber's van parked across the street. "It's been there for 48 hours, Leo said in a low voice. "The plates are fake. The company doesn't exist. My men can't get a clean look at who's inside." I watched Dante's expression. It didn't change, but the stillness in his body became something different, something predatory and lethal. A low, guttural command in Russian rumbled from his chest. He looked from the screen to me, his eyes sweeping over me as if assessing a vulnerability. He didn't have to say anything. I understood. We were being watched. The threat wasn't just Mark anymore, a lone, pathetic monster from my past. This was something else. This was professional. This was one of his own kind, a shark circling his territory, and I was the bait floating in the water. The glass walls of the penthouse no longer felt like a shield. They felt like the transparent sides of a fishbowl. That night, sleep offered no escape. The old nightmare came back with a vengeance. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the horrifying final silence of my sister's last breath. I woke up gasping, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sterile quiet of my room was suffocating, so I padded out into the vast living area, seeking the solace of the city lights. Dante was there, a dark silhouette against the glittering skyline, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He turned as I approached, and in the dim light, the mask of the ruthless Bratva leader was gone. He just looked like a man wrestling with his own demons. "Some ghosts prefer the dark," he said, his voice rough with an emotion I couldn't name. He didn't press me for details about my nightmare. Instead, he told me, in clipped, detached sentences, about a promise he had made long ago to protect someone and how he had failed. He spoke of the guilt that becomes a shadow, following you even in the brightest daylight. In that moment, we weren't a king and his subject. We were just two survivors, adrift in the wreckage of our pasts, finding a strange, fleeting comfort in knowing we weren't entirely alone in the dark. The package arrived the next afternoon at the office. It slipped through the layers of security like a ghost, addressed directly to me, my name typed in a clean, impersonal font. Leo intercepted it, his instincts on high alert, but after a scan revealed nothing dangerous, he brought it to my desk, his expression grim. My hands trembled as I opened the small, unassuming box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black tissue paper, was a single, perfect white rose. My stomach plummeted. They were my sister's favorite. I used to bring her a single white rose every week. Tucked beneath the stem was a tiny, folded piece of paper. The message was short, the words typed in the same sterile font. "He thinks his walls are high enough, but some ghosts you carry inside with you." This wasn't Mark's crude intimidation. This was a scalpel, precise and cruel, designed to cut straight to the deepest part of my grief. Someone knew me. Someone had dug into my past and found the one weapon that could truly break me. Dante's protection had put a target on my back, and his enemies were showing him they knew exactly where to aim for the kill shot. Dante's rage was a terrifying thing to behold. It wasn't loud or explosive. It was a sudden, absolute drop in temperature, a freezing silence that sucked all the air out of the room. He called a meeting with his most trusted men, his capos, in a soundproofed conference room. I watched them file in, their faces hard and unreadable. But I saw one man, Ricardo Gallo, who lingered for a moment. He offered me a small, sympathetic smile, but his eyes were cold, holding a glint of something that looked disturbingly like triumph. The meeting lasted for hours. When it was over, Leo found me staring out my office window, the dead rose still on my desk. The delivery was an inside job, he stated, his voice devoid of its usual dry wit. He explained that the rose was a message from them to Dante. It was a declaration. They were telling him that his new obsession, the waitress he had pulled from an alley, was a liability. They were proving they could get to her, and by extension, to him. I was no longer a person he was protecting out of honor. I was a weakness his enemies had found, and they were going to exploit me until he broke. I couldn't stand being a passive pawn in their deadly game. That evening, I stormed into his study, my fear finally eclipsed by a surge of desperate anger. He was standing over a massive, illuminated map of the city, moving small magnetic markers around like a general plotting a war. "You have to tell me everything," I demanded. my voice shaking but firm. "Who are the Morettis? Why do they want to hurt me? I am not some fragile doll you can hide in a box while you fight your battles. If I'm the target, I deserve to know who is holding the gun." He turned slowly, and for the first time, he didn't look at me with pity or frustration. He looked at me with something akin to respect. He gestured for me to come closer and explained the long, bloody history with the Moretti family, their rivalry for control of the city's ports. He pointed to Ricardo Gallo's picture on a screen. "I believe he is their man on the inside," he said. "They see you, your presence in my life, as a deviation from my code. They think you have made me soft." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "They think love is a weakness. I am going to teach them that it is a motive." To give me a semblance of normalcy, and perhaps to test his own security, Dante arranged for me to meet Sophia at a quiet cafe downtown. The place was swarming with his men, disguised as businessmen and construction workers, their presence a web of invisible protection. Seeing Sophia felt like that evening I stormed into his study, my fear finally eclipsed by a surge of desperate anger. He was standing over a massive, illuminated map of the city, moving small magnetic markers around like a general plotting a war. "You have to tell me everything," I demanded, my voice shaking but firm. "Who are the Morettis? Why do they want to hurt me? I am not some fragile doll you can hide in a box while you fight your battles. If I'm the target, I deserve to know who is holding the gun." He turned slowly, and for the first time, he didn't look at me with pity or frustration. He looked at me with something akin to respect. He gestured for me to come closer and explained the long, bloody history with the Moretti family, their rivalry for control of the city's ports. He pointed to Ricardo Gallo's picture on a screen. "I believe he is their man on the inside," he said. "They see you, your presence in my life, as a deviation from my code. They think you have made me soft." He took a step closer, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "They think love is a weakness. I am going to teach them that it is a motive." To give me a semblance of normalcy, and perhaps to test his own security, Dante arranged for me to meet Sophia at a quiet cafe downtown. The place was swarming with his men, disguised as businessmen and construction workers, their presence a web of invisible protection. Seeing Sophia felt like breathing fresh air after being trapped underground. Her hug was real, her worry was genuine, and for a fleeting hour, I almost felt like my old self. But as we said our goodbyes on the sidewalk, the illusion was shattered. A black motorcycle roared down the street, weaving through traffic at an impossible speed. The rider, clad in black leather and a full-face helmet, slowed just enough to toss a small, heavy object that skidded across the pavement and stopped at my feet. It was my sister's silver locket, the one I thought had been lost forever in the wreckage of the crash. It was dented and scratched, but unmistakably hers. Taped to it was a small, crudely written note. "Mark knows you have this." It was a lie, but it was a message. The traitor wasn't just working with the Morettis. He was feeding information to my own personal monster. My past and my present had just collided with the force of a freight train, and I was standing right on the tracks. The locket felt impossibly cold in my palm, a piece of frozen history dropped into the fire of my present. Sophia gasped beside me, her hand flying to her mouth as she recognized the dented silver heart. Dante's body went rigid, every muscle coiling into a state of lethal readiness. He moved so fast he was a blur, his arm wrapping around my waist, pulling me back from the curb as Leo stepped in front of us, his hand disappearing inside his jacket. The motorcycle was already gone, a fading snarl of engine noise swallowed by the city, but the message it left behind was a declaration of war. Mark knew. Or rather, someone wanted Dante to think Mark knew. The traitor, Ricardo, was not just feeding information to a rival family. He was playing both sides, weaving my personal monster into their corporate war, making the threat intimate and impossible to predict. Dante's voice was a low growl in my ear, directed at Leo. Get them in the car, now. The illusion of a normal hour in a normal cafe was gone, shattered into a million pieces. I was no longer just a woman under protection. I was the battlefield where two wars had just violently collided, and the first casualty was the hope that I could ever escape my past. Back in the penthouse, the sterile silence had been replaced by a storm of controlled chaos. Men in dark suits moved with quiet, deadly efficiency, their voices low murmurs on encrypted phones. Dante stood before the wall of glass, a predator surveying his territory, his reflection a mask of cold fury. He hadn't spoken a word to me since we'd returned, but I felt his anger radiating through the room, a palpable force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. I felt a familiar, crushing weight settle in my chest. Guilt. This was my fault. My monster had followed me here and breached his impenetrable walls. I was the weak link, the poison seeping into his world. I walked over to him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "This is because of me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, he won't stop." Dante turned slowly, his eyes boring into mine. "This is not about your ex-boyfriend," he stated, his voice a blade of ice. "He is a rabid dog, but he is on someone else's leash now. Ricardo is using your past to send me a message. He thinks he can unnerve me, make me reckless." He took a step closer, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "He is mistaken. He has only made me certain." The decision was made with chilling speed. We were moving, not to another one of his city properties, but to a secluded estate hours away, a true fortress deep in the countryside, where he could control every variable. The convoy consisted of 3 identical black sedans, all armored, moving in a tight, disciplined formation down the highway. I sat beside Dante in the center vehicle, the buttery leather a strange comfort against my frayed nerves. Leo was in the lead car. We were just clearing the city limits when a massive construction truck, seemingly out of nowhere, swerved violently across 3 lanes of traffic. Our driver cursed in Russian, braking hard, but it was too late. The truck slammed into the lead car, sending it spinning into the guardrail in a horrific screech of metal. Simultaneously, 2 black SUVs boxed us in from behind, and the world erupted in a hailstorm of gunfire. The windows spiderwebbed but held. Before I could even scream, Dante reacted. He threw his body over mine, his weight a solid, living shield, pushing me down onto the floor. "Stay down," he roared, the command cutting through the deafening noise. It was a professional, military-grade ambush, and we had driven right into its teeth. We were trapped. The car was a steel coffin, the rhythmic pinging of bullets against the armored plating, a constant, terrifying drumbeat. Our driver was slumped over the wheel, and the engine was dead. Through the fractured windshield, I could see armed men in tactical gear, advancing, their movements fluid and practiced. I was pressed against the floor, Dante's body a heavy, protective weight above me, his scent of expensive cologne and clean cotton filling my senses even in the midst of terror. He was completely calm, his breathing even, his focus absolute. He shifted slightly, pulling a compact pistol from an ankle holster, his movements economical and precise. He risked a glance at me, his dark eyes scanning for any injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and steady. In that moment, surrounded by violence and the imminent threat of death, a strange intimacy bloomed in the cramped space. He wasn't the cold Mafia boss. He was just a man, shielding me with everything he had. My wife, he said, suddenly, his voice tight. The car they were in wasn't armored, a cost-saving measure by a subordinate, a mistake I have never allowed to be made again. The confession hung in the air, a ghost of his past summoned by the violence of our present. His words explained everything: the obsessive security, the impenetrable penthouse, the constant shadows following me. It wasn't about a debt, it was about atonement. He was trying to rewrite the bloodiest chapter of his own history by keeping me safe. While the gunfire outside intensified, he worked, his mind a cold, tactical computer. He ripped open a panel beneath the dashboard, revealing a hidden keypad. "Leo will be here in minutes," he stated, his fingers flying across the buttons. "We just need to give them a reason to keep their distance." He looked at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "When I say the word, you will press the red button beside your seat. Do you understand?" I nodded, my hand shaking as I found the small recessed button. He was making me a part of our survival, not just cargo to be protected. As he worked, I found my voice. "The truck," I whispered, the memory of Sophia's crash flooding back. "It came out of nowhere, just like the car that hit us." He paused, his gaze softening with a shared, terrible understanding. In that steel cage, we weren't a king and a waitress. We were two survivors, haunted by the ghosts of screeching tires and shattered glass. The world outside erupted in a concussive boom, followed by shouts and a renewed, more frantic exchange of gunfire. Leo had arrived. Dante gave the order, and I slammed my thumb down on the red button. A thick, white smoke billowed from beneath the car, engulfing us completely. Minutes later, the passenger door was wrenched open, and Leo's face, grim and blood-streaked, appeared. "We're clear, boss." The drive to the safe house was a silent, tense blur. It was a sprawling stone mansion nestled in a dense forest, a place of quiet, formidable beauty. Inside, a fire was already roaring in a massive stone hearth. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a raw, trembling exhaustion in its wake. Dante led me to a deep leather armchair by the fire and knelt before me, his eyes scanning me for injuries again. He found a small cut on my forearm from a piece of shattered interior trim. He gently took my arm, his calloused thumb brushing away a smear of dirt. His touch was no longer clinical, it was personal, possessive, and achingly gentle. He held my gaze, and in the flickering firelight, I saw the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumble into dust. He had almost lost me, and the realization was a stark, terrifying truth reflected in his eyes. Later that night, the house was silent, except for the crackling fire and the whisper of the wind in the pines. Sleep was impossible, my mind replaying the ambush in a relentless loop. I found him in a dark, wood-paneled study, staring at a small, silver-framed photograph on his desk. He didn't seem surprised to see me. He simply picked up the frame and held it out. It was a woman with a radiant smile and a small boy with Dante's serious eyes. "My Anya and my Mikhail," he said, his voice thick with a grief that time had clearly not healed. He told me everything then, not in fragments, but in a flood of raw, unvarnished pain. He explained that his rivals had used his family's predictable schedule, school drop-offs, trips to the park, to orchestrate their murder. They had used his love as a weapon. "I swore I would never feel that again," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the flames. "To care for someone in my world is to hand your enemy the knife they will use to cut your heart out." My own grief for my sister rose up to meet his, a silent wave of understanding. I stepped forward and did the only thing I could. I covered his hand with mine where it rested on the desk. He flinched, then slowly, hesitantly, turned his hand over and laced his fingers through mine. That single, quiet touch changed everything. It was a silent acknowledgement. a treaty signed between two warring nations of grief and isolation. When he looked at me, the last of his icy control was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability that mirrored my own. We were no longer bound by a life debt or a strategic alliance. We were connected by the far stronger, more dangerous threads of shared pain and burgeoning affection. We both knew, without a word being spoken, that we had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. And as I stood there, his hand holding mine as if it were a lifeline, a chilling certainty settled in my soul. Ricardo Gallo would report what happened today. He would tell the Morettis that Dante Volkov, the ghost, the man who treated emotions as a fatal disease, had shielded a waitress with his own body. He would tell them that Dante's obsession had become something far more perilous. Our enemies had been trying to use me to break his focus. Now they would realize they had been handed a far more powerful weapon. They would no longer just try to remove me from the board. They would try to use our bond, this fragile, fierce connection, to destroy him completely. The fragile piece of the countryside estate was shattered by the shrill ring of a satellite phone. I watched from the doorway of the study as Leo delivered the news, his face a mask of stone, but his voice was tight with a barely controlled urgency. 3 of the Volkov warehouses at the port had been hit by coordinated explosions. The fires were still raging, consuming millions of dollars in legitimate cargo and gutting the heart of Dante's public-facing empire. It was a crippling blow, a message sent with fire and shrapnel. I saw Dante's posture change. He didn't erupt in anger. He became unnervingly still, a predator gathering itself for a kill. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Casualties? Dante's voice was a low, deadly whisper. Leo's hesitation was answer enough. 12 men, all loyal. 12 families without fathers, husbands, and sons. 12 lives extinguished because the Morettis and Ricardo knew exactly how to wound him. They had found his weakness, and it was me. The guilt was a physical thing, a cold stone in my stomach. My one small act of kindness in a dark alley had just become a death sentence for men I had never even met. The next blow was not aimed at his empire. It was aimed directly at my heart. Another call came, this one from a burner phone Leo kept for emergencies. I saw the blood drain from his face as he listened, his knuckles white where he gripped the device. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pity that terrified me more than any threat. "It's Sophia," he said, his voice rough. "She was leaving her shift. 2 men, they didn't take anything. They just put her in the hospital." The words didn't register at first. Sophia. My Sophia. The one person who had been my anchor in the storm. The only piece of my old life that was still pure and untouched by this darkness. Now she was lying in a hospital bed, broken and beaten, because of me. Mark. It had to be Mark. He knew she was my only friend, my sister in everything but blood. Ricardo must have given him the information, a cruel little gift to his new business partner. I sank into a chair, the world spinning around me. I was a contagion, a walking disaster. Every person I cared about, every life I touched, was now a target in a war I had never asked to be a part of. The news about Sophia broke something in Dante. The cold, calculating control was replaced by a raw, possessive fury that was terrifying to behold. He ordered the estate locked down completely. I was no longer a guest. I was a prisoner. Guards were posted outside my door. My encrypted phone was taken away. "You will not leave this room," he commanded, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You are not safe." It was his fear talking, his own ghosts whispering in his ear, but it felt like Mark's cage all over again. Later, I overheard him arguing with Leo in the hall. "I will not lose her, Leo. I will not make the same mistake twice." Leo's reply was a low, desperate murmur I wasn't meant to hear. "This is what you did with Anya, boss. You tried to lock her away from the world, and it only made her more desperate to leave. It's what put her on that road on that day." The words hit me like a physical blow. Anya hadn't just been a victim of his enemies. She had been running from him, from his suffocating, fear-driven control. My blood ran cold. He wasn't trying to rewrite his past. He was doomed to repeat it, and I was cast in the role of his tragic, doomed wife. My trust in him, so fragile and newly formed, evaporated into a mist of fear and suspicion. I looked at him and no longer saw a protector. I saw a man so blinded by his own trauma that he was becoming the very monster he fought against. Every promise of safety now sounded like a threat of ownership. The weight of my guilt was crushing. Sophia in the hospital, 12 men dead, his empire burning. It was all a chain reaction started by me. I was the liability. I was the weakness his enemies were so expertly exploiting. I had to get out. Not for myself, but for him, for everyone. If I was gone, if the target was removed from the board, maybe the violence would stop. Maybe Sophia could heal in peace. Maybe Dante could go back to being the untouchable ghost his enemies feared, instead of a man made reckless by a waitress he'd pulled from the gutter. The decision settled in my soul with the cold finality of a tombstone. I had to run. I had to disappear so completely that I would become a ghost myself, a phantom that could no longer bring ruin to the living. I would save him by destroying any trace of my existence in his world. Dante's misjudgment was my only opportunity. Consumed by his need to control the situation, he pulled all his most trusted men, including Leo, into a war council in his study, planning a retaliation that I knew would only lead to more bloodshed. He thought the guards at my door were enough. He thought his fortress was absolute. But he didn't know that I had spent my first day here walking the grounds, memorizing every path, every gate, every shadow, because a part of me had always known I might need to run. He saw me as a damsel to be rescued, not as a survivor who had spent 2 years learning how to be invisible. I waited until the deepest point of the night, when the guard change was happening. I slipped out a small bathroom window that led to a narrow ledge, my heart hammering against my ribs. I left the cashmere scarf, the one he had returned to me so carefully cleaned, folded neatly on the pillow. It was a goodbye. It was an apology. It was a severing of the debt, paid in full with my own vanishing act. I was trading his gilded cage for the cold, terrifying freedom of the unknown, praying it would be enough to keep him alive. The moment he found the empty room, the cold scarf lying on the bed like a funeral shroud, was the moment Riccardo Gallo had been waiting for. With Dante's focus shattered, his mind not on his empire but on the one woman who had breached his defenses from the inside, the traitor made his move. He sent a signal to the Morettis, letting them know the ghost was compromised, his attention diverted. He walked into Dante's study, not as a subordinate, but as an equal, and laid out his terms, backed by a third of Dante's capos who now stood with him. It was a coup, executed with surgical precision. While Dante was reeling from what felt like my ultimate betrayal, his organization was being carved up from within. And I was out in the cold, a lone figure on a deserted country road, with no phone, no money, and nowhere to go. I had thought my disappearance would save him, but I had only succeeded in handing his enemies the perfect moment to strike. I was utterly alone, hunted by Mark and the Morettis, having abandoned the one man who could have protected me, leaving him to face his own ruin. I eventually made it to a bus station in a small, forgotten town, my reflection in the dirty window showing a ghost I barely recognized. I was a fool. I had run from Dante's protection directly into the path of a dozen predators, all of whom now had every reason to find me. My freedom was an illusion, a vast, open-air prison where every shadow held a threat. I had traded one kind of fear for another, and in the process I had likely destroyed the only man who had ever truly seen me. Back at the estate, the final nail was hammered into the coffin of the world we had briefly built. Leo brought Dante the news. Riccardo had not just betrayed him, He had taken something Dante valued more than any warehouse or shipping route. He had taken the location of the small, hidden cemetery plot where Anya and Mikhail were buried. It was the ultimate violation, a desecration of the one sacred piece of his past. He was broken, his empire fractured, and the woman he had tried to save was lost to the wind. We were both at rock bottom, separated by miles of road and a chasm of misunderstanding, with the wolves closing in on us from all sides. The news of Ricardo's ultimate betrayal, the desecration of his family's grave, did not unleash the storm of rage Leo had expected. Instead, it triggered a terrifying calm in Dante, a sudden and absolute drop in temperature that froze the very air in the room. The pain of my perceived abandonment, coupled with this violation, was a wound so deep that it cauterized itself into pure, cold focus. He gathered the 5 men who remained unquestionably loyal, their faces grim in the flickering firelight of the study. His voice, when he finally spoke, was devoid of all emotion, a flat, metallic instrument of command. He was no longer a king fighting for his empire. He was an executioner preparing his tools. His vast network of intelligence, once used to build a kingdom, was now repurposed for a single final task: annihilation. He didn't search for me. In his mind, I was a ghost, a phantom of a mistake he had allowed himself to make. To think of me, to feel the gaping hole my absence left, was a weakness he could not afford. He had to believe I was gone forever, so he compartmentalized the heartbreak, locking it away behind a wall of ice and steel, focusing every ounce of his formidable will on the trap he was about to set for Ricardo Gallo. I was huddled in the corner of a grimy all-night bus station, 100 miles from anywhere, when I saw it. A small television mounted in the corner was playing the local news, and the screen was filled with images of roaring fires against the night sky. Suspected arson guts Volkov warehouses at City Port. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. My running hadn't saved him. My grand, noble act of self-sacrifice had been the catalyst for his ruin. I had handed his enemies the perfect diversion, leaving him vulnerable and distracted while they tore his world apart. The guilt was a suffocating wave, but beneath it, a new feeling began to stir. A fierce, defiant anger. I would not be a ghost haunting the wreckage of his life. I had to go back. I had to do something. My mind raced, searching for a weapon, any leverage I could possibly have. And then it came to me, the SD card, the ghost that Mark had been chasing for 2 years. I knew I didn't have it, but he didn't know that. More importantly, I knew where he kept his secrets. A storage unit on the industrial side of town. He'd bragged about it once, confident I was too broken to ever use the information. It was my only move, my only way back into the fight. Dante's plan was a masterpiece of brutal simplicity. His sources had confirmed the meeting, a derelict shipyard at midnight. Ricardo, the Moretti brothers, and Mark Kenson all gathered in one place to finalize the hostile takeover. Dante's remaining men were positioned at every exit, a ring of steel closing around the traitors. He wasn't planning a surgical strike. He was planning a massacre. He would walk into the heart of it himself, a specter of vengeance reclaiming his meme or dying with it. Leo argued, pleaded, but saw the finality in his boss's eyes. This was atonement. Meanwhile, I had made it back to the city, the bitter taste of cheap coffee my only fuel. The lock on Mark's storage unit was laughably easy to break. Inside, amidst dusty boxes of confiscated goods, I found it. Not the SD card, but something infinitely more valuable, his private ledger, a meticulous record of every bribe, every shakedown, every crime he'd ever committed to climb the ranks. It was his entire corrupt career in a single dog-eared notebook. Using a payphone that reeked of desperation, I called his private number. "I have it all, Mark," I said, my voice steady. "Everything. Let's trade. My life for your secrets. Meet me at the old shipyard, alone." The air at the shipyard was thick with the smell of salt and decay, a graveyard of forgotten industry. I clutched the ledger to my chest, my only shield. Mark emerged from the oppressive shadows between two rusting hulls, his silhouette oozing a triumphant arrogance. "Well, well, Ellie, finally decided to come home," he sneered, his eyes fixated on the notebook in my hands. He took a step toward me, his hand outstretched, the victory he had craved for 2 years finally within his grasp. At that exact moment, the night erupted. The sharp crack of a sniper rifle was followed by a symphony of automatic gunfire. Lights flooded the shipyard, turning the shadows into stark, running figures. Mark reacted instantly, his police training kicking in. He grabbed me, spinning me around to use as a shield, his arm a vice around my throat as he dragged me behind a massive shipping container. Through a gap in the metal, my eyes locked with Dante's across the chaos. He had frozen mid-stride, his face a mask of stunned disbelief. She's here. She didn't run from me. She ran into the war. The realization shattered his icy control, and in that instant, the general abandoned his battle plan. The king was coming for his queen, and damn the consequences. He moved through the firefight like a phantom, his pistol barking in controlled, deadly pairs. He was no longer a strategist directing his troops. He was a singular force of nature. Every instinct, every fiber of his being focused on closing the distance between us. Mark tightened his grip, pressing the cold muzzle of his gun against my temple. "That's far enough, Volkov," he screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "She's mine. She's always been mine." But I wasn't that terrified girl anymore. I looked at Dante, at the raw, desperate fear for me in his eyes, and I knew I couldn't be a passive victim. I would not be the prize in their war. "He's bluffing, Dante," I shouted, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed. "He killed my sister for nothing, for a lie." With a surge of adrenaline, I drove my heel down onto Mark's instep and slammed my head back into his nose. He roared in pain, his grip faltering for a single crucial second. It was all Dante needed. A single, precise shot echoed in the night. As Mark fell, Ricardo Gallo stepped out from behind another container, his own gun leveled at Dante's exposed back. But Leo was already there, a loyal shadow, and 2 quiet thuds from his silenced pistol ended the betrayal for good. The sudden silence was more shocking than the gunfire. It was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the distant lap of the tide. Dante was in front of me in a heartbeat, his hands coming up to cup my face, his thumbs gently tracing my cheekbones as if to assure himself I was real. His perfect suit was torn and stained, his composure utterly gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. "You came back," he breathed, the words a prayer of disbelief. I leaned into his touch, my own hands covering his. "I had to," I whispered. "I couldn't let you fight this alone." We stood there, surrounded by the remnants of his shattered empire, and the ghosts we had both finally laid to rest. The debt was gone. The need for protection was gone. All that remained was a choice, made silently in the space between our shared breaths. He didn't offer me safety or security. He simply held out his hand. "Come home, Elena," he said, and it was a question filled with a hope that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. I took his hand, our fingers lacing together in a perfect fit. "I am home," I answered, knowing that home was no longer a place, but the quiet, unshakable strength I found only with him. The chaos of the shipyard gave way to a cold, methodical cleanup that was just as brutal in its efficiency. Mark's ledger, handed over to a single honest captain Leo knew on the force, acted like a key turning in a rotten lock. The entire corrupt structure Mark had built came crashing down, taking dozens of dirty cops with it. The news called it the biggest police scandal in a decade. To me, it was just the closing of a book I never wanted to read. Dante, in the meantime, purged his own house with the precision of a surgeon. The capos loyal to Ricardo simply vanished, their names erased from the ledgers of Volkov Global Logistics as if they had never existed. The Moretti family, leaderless and exposed, crumbled under the weight of federal investigations Dante had anonymously triggered. He didn't sit me down to explain the details in hushed, secretive tones. Instead, he brought me into his study, the real one, and laid the new organizational charts on the massive mahogany desk. He pointed to an empty box at the top, right beside his own. "This is your decision," he said, his voice quiet. "Partner, consultant, or you can walk away. The choice is yours." He wasn't giving me a cage, he was giving me a key to the kingdom. I chose to build something new. A year after the shipyard, the scent of garlic and fresh basil replaced the smell of gunpowder and fear. We opened a small restaurant in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a world away from the greasy diner and the cold penthouse. On the polished glass of the front window, elegant gold letters spelled out Sophia's place. It was a tribute, a memorial, and a promise. A promise that her memory would be a source of life and warmth, not a ghost of guilt. Dante funneled his resources into it, not as a controlling investor, but as a silent partner who just happened to be an expert in sourcing the finest ingredients from around the world. He'd show up in the middle of the afternoon, his imposing frame looking oddly at home in the bustling kitchen, carrying a crate of Sicilian tomatoes or a wheel of Parmesan he'd had flown in that morning. Leo became our most loyal customer, occupying the same corner booth every Friday night, complaining about the portion sizes while ordering a second dessert. I was no longer a waitress serving others. I was a creator, building a sanctuary of my own, a place where the only debts were the tab's happy customers ran up at the bar. The country estate was no longer a fortress, it was a home. The guards were still there, a quiet, reassuring presence on the perimeter, but inside the heavy doors were propped open to let in the summer air. We spent our evenings by the same stone hearth where he had first told me about Anya and Mikhail. We no longer spoke of them as ghosts, but as memories that had shaped the man I had come to love. One night, I found him staring into the flames, the old silver-framed photograph in his hands. He didn't look haunted, he looked peaceful. "They would have liked you," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Anya would have admired your fire, and Misha, he would have convinced you to make him cookies every day." He placed the frame on the mantel, not hiding it away, but giving it a place of honor. He then took my hand, his thumb tracing the faint lines on my palm. "The debt was never yours to repay, Elena," he whispered, his dark eyes holding mine. In that moment, the last of the shadows between us finally dissolved, burned away by the warmth of a love we had both thought was impossible. Tonight, Sophia's place is alive with the warm buzz of conversation and the clinking of wine glasses. The air is thick with the aroma of simmering sauces and the sound of laughter. From my place behind the host stand, I can see it all. I see Leo trying to subtly steal a breadstick from his date's plate. I see families sharing meals, friends celebrating, and couples leaning in close, lost in their own worlds. And across the room, I see Dante. He's not watching the exits or scanning for threats. He's just watching me. A small, genuine smile on his face, the kind of smile that reaches his eyes and makes them shine. He raises his glass in a silent toast. It's a toast to second chances, to the strange, winding path that led a broken waitress from a dark alley to this beautiful, noisy, wonderful life. My past isn't gone, but it no longer owns me. It's a part of the story that brought me here to him. And I am so incredibly grateful that you've been here to listen to it. Your support makes it possible for stories like this to be told, reminding us all that even after the darkest storm, there can be a sunrise. I raise my glass back to him, my heart full, finally at peace.